good morning. Today we are continuing our series from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, and we are now getting towards the end of the series. This week and next week we're going to be looking at the final stages of Jeremiah's story. Then, as I said in the notices, on the 24th it's the joint service at CVC. Then on the 1st of December, which is the following Sunday after that, as we start to think about and get ready for Christmas, we're going to be looking at one of Jeremiah's prophecies linked to the coming of Jesus. Then as on the 8th, we've got Dan and Annie coming, and then we're kind of right into Christmas mode by then. So we've only got 3 more Sundays where we'll be looking at the book of Jeremiah. But one of the things that we've said as we've gone through the book of Jeremiah is that it's not a book that is chronological. And so if you're just trying to simply follow the story through, you don't start at chapter 1 and read it right through to the end, because it's constantly dotting backwards and forwards. We know from chapter 1 that Jeremiah was the prophet to Judah, so the southern kingdom, during the reigns of the last 5 kings of Judah. And Jeremiah's message was one of warning and judgment. Right back from the beginning of the relationship between God and his people, God had laid out, if you do what I say, these are going to be the blessings that will come your way. But if you turn your backs on me, if you go your own way, if you worship foreign gods, then there will be all of these curses that will come your way. And we've seen over the last few years, as we've walked through kind of the history of the Old Testament in the autumn term each year, that God, it's been a pretty sorry story. The people have continually turned away from God, and God has consistently warned his disobedient people of what would happen to them if they turned their backs on them, reminding them of what he'd said right back at the beginning. Last year we were looking at Isaiah, and this year Jeremiah. So just 2 of the prophets who were sent to warn the people. If you continue going on the road you are going, then disaster is coming. Jerusalem will be taken, you will be exiled. In Jeremiah's time, there were 2 main kind of world dominant superpowers. Once upon a time, there had been Assyria, which would come down from the north, but by the time we're into Jeremiah's story, the Assyrians are no more, and the Babylonians are a major power threatening Judah from the north. And then there is also the old enemy, Egypt, in the south. And so throughout Jeremiah's lifetime, Judah is in the middle with kind of Babylon threatening the north and Egypt threatening in the south. King Josiah had been killed in a battle with the Egyptians, and then the following kings after that are really nothing more than puppets who had been put in place either by an Egyptian king or put in place by a Babylonian king and required to pay all sorts of tax and tribute to either Egypt or to Babylon. And the events that we've just read in Jeremiah 37 and 38 take place during the reign of Zedekiah, who you can see from the screen is Judah's last king, and he'd been put there by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And yet Zedekiah's instinct was to rebel against Babylon and against Nebuchadnezzar. Whereas Jeremiah's consistent message to the king and to the people and to the army is the only way you are going to save yourselves is if you hand yourselves over, if you surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. Because God has chosen Nebuchadnezzar to be the one who is going to bring his judgment on this people for all those hundreds of years of rebellion that have gone before. There is no escaping God's judgment. Time has finally run out. But Zedekiah has always got his eye on Egypt down there in the south, and he hopes that some kind of allegiance with Egypt might be the thing that rescues him from Nebuchadnezzar. But Jeremiah's message is Egypt will not save you, so don't think about going over to them. So that's kind of the context, and Zedekiah and his advisors, and indeed all of the people, pay absolutely no attention to what Jeremiah has been saying. And they pay no attention, therefore, to what God is saying to them. One of the things that I have on my kind of unwritten list of things I want to do at some point when I've got a few minutes is to do a study on the phrase, the fear of the Lord, in the Bible. At the beginning of September, our verse of the week came from Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And yet in 1 John 4, we read that there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And so kind of what is going on here? Are we supposed to fear God? And if we are supposed to fear God, what does that look like? What does it mean? Is it simply a case that this is a Old Testament thing, fear God, as opposed to a New Testament thing where we are called to love God? Well, no, it's not simply a Old Testament versus New Testament thing, because there are verses in the New Testament, such as this one from Acts chapter 9, verse 31, where it talks about the New Testament people of God also fearing the Lord. In Isaiah chapter 11, I know it's an Old Testament passage, but it's talking about the Messiah. It's talking about Jesus, who the people were looking forward to. And it says that one of the characteristics of the Messiah will be that the Messiah will fear the Lord. And fear is very often a key motivating driver in the way that we act and the way that we behave. The decisions that we make, the things that we do, the things that we don't do. And often there are competing fears. If I don't go to this party, I'm going to miss out on a good time with my friends, and maybe my friends aren't going to accept me into the in crowd. But if I don't go, then when am I going to do my revision? And if I don't do my revision, I won't do well in a test. And if I don't do well in the test, I won't get the exam results, etc., etc., etc. So the competing fears and our decisions are often made on the basis of which of those fears is greatest at that particular moment in time. And when you read through the chapters that we read earlier on, and if you wanted to go through and read all of chapter 7 and the rest of chapter 38 at some point, then Zedekiah comes across as a person who cannot make up his own mind of what he thinks. And in every situation, he seems to act based on fear and kind of self-preservation in the short term. He has no thought about anything else. He's certainly got no thought about the warnings that Jeremiah and the things that Jeremiah has been saying. And so, for example, when the advisors come to him and they make these allegations against Jeremiah, he doesn't stand up for what is right. Instead, he tells his advisors, well, just you do what you think is the right thing to do. I'm only the king. I can't possibly get in the way, which, of course, is absolute nonsense. And so Jeremiah ends up being put down a well. In the previous chapter, he was put in prison. But I'll leave you to read that for yourselves. But then this guy, Ebed-Melech, turns up and wants to defend Jeremiah. And the king says, well, you go and do what you want to do. You go and take 30 people with you and pull Jeremiah up out of the well. The king's reason for not handing himself over to Nebuchadnezzar is that he is afraid of what the Jews who've already gone over to Nebuchadnezzar might do to him. And even though Jeremiah reassures him that Nebuchadnezzar won't hand you over to those Jews, he still refuses to do what Jeremiah says. We live in uncertain times. I expect and anticipate that the next 4 years might be more chaotic and more uncertain and more dangerous than the last few years have been. Last week, we were thinking about the persecuted church and the work of organisations like Open Doors. Today, we've read a little bit about what life was like for Jeremiah in prison, down a well. Next week, we're going to look at the last part of his story, and it does, believe it or not, get even worse. When we think about the context into which Jesus came, or the context into which people like the Apostle Paul were speaking, they were speaking to people who were living under Roman occupation. And so when it comes to listening to God's word in the Bible, a lot of it was written within contexts that were a lot more chaotic, a lot more uncertain, and a lot more dangerous than the context in which we read it. And therefore, we can take comfort from the words that we read, and we can put our trust in the God who has said these things. Every time Jeremiah opened his mouth, he must have literally feared for his life. And I think that for me, one of the challenges from stories like the chapters that we've read from Jeremiah today and stories of people like Zedekiah is a challenge that in uncertain times, in dangerous times, that it is really important that I know what I believe and I make my decisions based on what I know to be the truth. And to make sure that I don't allow my fears of what might happen, or fears of what people might say, or what people might think, or what people might do, I mustn't allow those fears to dictate how I behave. That my decision-making must be based on the truth and doing what is right, and not on a fear of what might happen to me if I do X, Y, or Z. Jeremiah was unwavering in his message. He knew that doing the right thing would very often get him into trouble. And it did often get him into trouble in one way or another. In fact, his 40 years of ministry, on the title graphic we've got listening to Jeremiah, success or failure. And from lots of perspectives, you look at Jeremiah's ministry and he looks like a failure. No one listened to him. Everyone ignored him. He was often persecuted and marginalized, and chapter 37 put into prison, chapter 38 put down a well. He knew that doing the right thing would get him into trouble, and yet he carried on doing the right thing time and time again. And so what fears might dictate our decision-making? I think I mentioned this a little while ago, but if you are a user of social media, then you might have come across the following sort of image where there's this phrase, "do not fear," occurs 365 times in the Bible. That's a daily reminder of the to be fearless every day. Unfortunately, it's not true. It doesn't say that in the Bible 365 times. It's nowhere close. And even AI, if you type into AI and say, does the Bible say it 365 times, do not fear? AI will pick up on things like this and say, yes, it does. But a simple Bible search will reveal that no, it's nowhere close. Do not fear and do not be afraid appears nowhere near 365 times. But it does appear. And quite often when it does appear, it's within the context of an angel turns up or somebody experiences the vision of God, and their immediate response to seeing an angel or response to seeing some image of God or heaven is to fall flat on their face as though dead. And yet God's gracious response, through either directly or through a vision or through an angel, is to lift them up and say, do not be afraid. I'm doing an assembly in a couple of weeks at Barton. And at this time of year, my mission is always to try to get the teacher responsible for the nativity play not to have the angels as cute little reception girls with blonde hair and halos, because if an angel appeared, we would fall flat on our faces as though dead. We wouldn't go, how cute. And so there is that, in that sense, God is to be feared, and our response to seeing God would be to fall on our faces. And yet, because of the cross, as we've been thinking earlier on in our service, because of Jesus, we can come with confidence into the presence of God. We can come as a child would come into the presence of a loving parent. I always think it's interesting when, with my office, how different people approach the door and kind of knock very tentatively sometimes and don't always hear when I've said come in. And yet my children never bother knocking. They just barge straight in, whatever I'm doing. And there's that sense in which, because we are children of God, we are able to come unhindered into the presence of God because he is a loving parent. And yet he is holy, but he is forgiving. A day of judgment is coming. God is righteous. God seeks justice, but he's also compassionate and gracious. And so I think when the Bible is talking about the fear of the Lord, I think it's one of those things where we are supposed to go away and ponder it and think about it and kind of make a cup of coffee or go for a long walk and kind of mull it out. What exactly does this mean? We're supposed to hold these tensions, these things in balance, and try and work out what exactly are the Bible writers saying. And I think it's got to do with our reverence, it's got to do with our respect, our high regard, and our love, and our allegiance to the God who died on a cross for us. And so, when there are these competing fears that are impacting my decision-making process, when there are these competing fears that maybe they're trying to pull me away from doing what I know is the right thing, these competing fears that maybe keep me from speaking up or make me keep my head down. There are these competing fears, and I think what the fear of the Lord means is that in the end, even though I might be fearful of the consequences, I will do what I believe God is asking me to do, even if that means I will get into trouble. At the start, we had this slide up, and we talked about how over the years when Jeremiah was a prophet, sometimes Babylon would come, sometimes Egypt would come, and all heading towards 586 BC when Babylon would totally exile Judah. But the red arrow up there is Daniel. So that's when Daniel. So one of those times when Nebuchadnezzar came to Judah and took away a whole bunch of kind of the elite, the princes. Daniel and his three friends got taken where that red arrow is. So Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were taken as prisoners to Babylon at that point. And we looked at Daniel back in 2021, and Daniel is one of my favorite books in the Bible. And time again, Daniel and his friends know what the right thing to do is, and they do it even at great personal risk. I think one of the things that we're going to see over the next few years, both as the cost of living crisis continues to bite, and also through the rhetoric of populist politicians, we are going to see people being encouraged to make decisions based on the fear of a scarcity mindset. That if this is allowed to happen, or if that is allowed to happen, then there's not going to be enough for me. And because there's not going to be enough, I need to make sure that I grab what I can whilst I can, and once I've got it, I hold on to it and keep it for myself, because we are being told that there is not enough. And these people or those people or this situation means that you do not have enough. And that's one of the fears that people are deliberately tapping into. And I think we will see more of that again over these next 4 years. But when, as a number of us have been doing, we've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount throughout 2024, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. When you read through the Sermon on the Mount, you quickly realize that a scarcity or fear from a scarcity mindset isn't an option. Jesus wants us, instructs us, commands us to be generous, to be those that put our trust in God. God will provide. God is the one who can be trusted. I don't need to grab things for myself. I don't need to hold on to what I have. But being generous can sometimes, it's just one example of a situation where being generous goes hand in hand with the fear of, well, what if there's not enough for me? If I'm generous, will there be enough for me? And sometimes we allow that fear to dictate the choices that we make. But Jesus doesn't say there isn't going to be worry, but he does say, don't worry. Trust your loving Heavenly Father. Do not be afraid. Let's pray.